When I heard that voice coming out of the woods, I knew it never should have been recorded. It wasn't immediate fear. It was something harder to explain. Like my body understood before my mind did that the recording had crossed a line that wasn't ours. The voice didn't sound far away, or distorted, or tangled up with the natural sounds of the forest. It was too clear, too organized. It had rhythm, intention, pauses. It didn't sound like an animal reacting to its surroundings. It sounded like someone choosing words. I spent several minutes listening to the same snippet over and over, trying to force it into some comfortable explanation. Wind through the trees. A strange echo, some kind of interference. Anything that wouldn't require me to accept what was obvious. But the more I listened, the more it became undeniable that the voice knew it was being heard. And more than that, it was responding. Not to a specific call, but to human presence there, in that space we've always treated as neutral, empty, available. There's a huge difference between hearing a weird sound in the woods and hearing something that feels aware. Sounds happen. Awareness reveals itself. And that recording wasn't a random noise drifting through nowhere. It carried structure. It carried warning. It carried something that wasn't said by accident. The most disturbing part was that nothing about it seemed designed to scare. There was no obvious aggression, no screaming, no direct threat. There was communication. And maybe that's exactly why it's so hard to accept. For a long time, the idea that Bigfoot could talk has always been treated like a joke, an exaggeration, or a delusion, something reserved for badly told stories. Obscure forums, theories people love to mock. I used to see it that way too, because as long as Bigfoot is just a silent figure, he stays safely inside the territory of myth. But the moment he speaks, everything changes. Speaking implies thought. It implies choice. It implies awareness of the other. It implies we're not dealing with just a creature, but a presence. This recording didn't come from some dramatic, made-for-TV situation. It wasn't captured by someone chasing fame or by a group trying to prove something to the world. It showed up in the most unsettling way possible, by accident, in an ordinary moment, in a completely mundane situation. And maybe that's exactly why it hits so hard, because it didn't arrive with a ready-made storyline, editing, or clear agenda. It simply exists. And once you accept that, you can't keep pretending certain questions don't need to be asked. As I kept digging into this story, I started to realize this audio isn't some isolated clip lost in the depths of the internet. It connects to older accounts, ignored testimonies, convenient silences. People who heard similar things and were never taken seriously. Records that vanished. Files that got deleted. Conversations shut down way too fast. Always with the same excuse. It doesn't make sense. But since when does reality need to make sense to make us uncomfortable? What struck me most wasn't only what was said, it was the reaction it caused in the people who had access to that recording. Some people backed away immediately. Others tried to explain it at any cost. Others went quiet, because accepting that something like this exists takes more than curiosity. It requires admitting we might not be the only ones capable of watching, assessing, and responding. And that touches something deep inside us. Before I go any further, I want to ask you for something simple but important. Write in the comments where you're watching from. City, state, country. It doesn't matter where you are, because this story doesn't belong to one specific place. It cuts across forests, regions, borders, and cultures. What changes are the names, the landscapes, and the ways people try to explain the unexplainable. The discomfort is always the same. Over the years, we've learned to look at the forest like a backdrop, a place we enter, explore, document, and leave. A space that exists to be used, mapped, classified. That view makes us feel safe. It puts us in control. But this recording challenges that logic completely. It suggests there may be rules we didn't create, boundaries we didn't draw, presences that don't care how we tell our stories. There's something deeply unsettling about the idea of a voice that doesn't want to be understood, but also doesn't want to be ignored. Something that speaks not to explain itself, but to mark territory. And once you start stacking that alongside other accounts, other strange recordings, other long stretches of silence, the feeling of coincidence begins to fade. What's left is the sense that certain things stay invisible only because we choose not to look too closely. Maybe the hardest part is admitting we're not just dealing with curiosity or mystery, we're dealing with consequence. Because if something speaks, it also watches. If it watches, it evaluates. And if it evaluates, it reacts. That changes the way we see not only Bigfoot, but everything tied to disappearances, ignored warnings, and stories that never reached the public the way they should have. At some point, I had to stop and ask myself why this kind of recording never shows up in a clear, official, acknowledged way. Why everything connected to this topic is always treated like exaggeration or insanity. And the answer that started to form wasn't comfortable. Sometimes it's not that there's no evidence. It's that certain evidence creates more problems than solutions. It forces people to question beliefs that are too old, too foundational, to be challenged in public. This story isn't about proving something to convince people who refuse to listen. It's about understanding why certain voices get dismissed automatically before anyone even analyzes them. It's about realizing there may be a layer of reality we've trained ourselves to ignore because it pulls us out of the center. And nothing feels more threatening than the possibility that we aren't the main character in the narrative. I know that from here on out, a lot of people will try to reduce all of this to coincidence, noise, or a hoax. That's expected. It's easier that way. But there's a reason this recording keeps resurfacing, getting shared, getting discussed in whispers. Because it triggers something that can't be solved with quick explanations. It lingers. It bothers you. It insists. And the deeper I went into this material, the clearer it became that that voice wasn't the beginning of the story. It was just the first audible sign of something that had always been there watching, waiting for the moment someone would finally hear. The problem is, once you've heard it, you can't pretend it was just your imagination. And that's exactly where everything starts getting even more serious. After hearing that audio for the first time, it became impossible to treat it like just another weird forest recording. It wasn't only the sound itself, but the way it was arranged. There was a beginning, a middle, and pauses. There were moments where the voice seemed to wait, like it was calculating the reaction of whoever was listening. That doesn't happen with random sounds. Wind doesn't wait. An animal doesn't measure silence. There was intention there, and intention completely breaks the comfortable logic we use to explain strange noises in the woods. The more I analyzed that audio, the more obvious it became that it didn't match any known pattern. It didn't have the typical irregularity of an animal, or the predictable repetition of a bird, or the chaotic quality of something reacting instinctively to the environment. The rhythm was too strange to be natural and too organized to be accidental. The pauses were glitches. They felt placed on purpose, like the voice knew exactly when to stop and when to continue. A lot of people try to solve recordings like this with the easiest explanation. Someone imitating, someone messing around, someone trying to scare people. But that theory starts to fall apart when you notice technical details. The apparent distance of the sound source doesn't shift erratically. There isn't the typical variation of someone moving while speaking. There's no exaggerated breath work, no common stumbling you hear when someone is improvising. The voice doesn't feel performative. It feels functional. Some experts who had access to the audio tried to analyze it from different angles: linguistics, acoustics, bioacoustics. No final conclusion emerged. Not because they didn't want to explain it, but because the categories just couldn't hold it. The audio doesn't behave like normal human speech, but it also doesn't behave like known animal vocalizations. It sits in an uncomfortable space between the two, and that's exactly where the problem lives. The bigger discomfort isn't proving it's real. The discomfort is realizing that if it is real, it shouldn't be there. A recording like that shouldn't exist. There shouldn't be an articulated voice coming out of the woods, outside any human context, with no mediation, no warning. That kind of thing doesn't fit in a report, doesn't fit in a quick explanation, doesn't fit in a headline without raising more questions than answers. Another detail that weighs heavily is the involuntary emotional reaction the audio triggers. Even in skeptical people who are used to analyzing strange sounds, there's a moment of silence after it plays, not shock, but processing. Like the brain needs a few extra seconds to decide which mental drawer it belongs in. And when it can't find one, what's left isn't curiosity. It's discomfort. If you've ever felt that kind of discomfort hearing something you can't quite explain, write the word strange in the comments. Not as judgment, but as recognition. Because that reaction shows up often when we're faced with something that shouldn't make sense, but does. The audio also doesn't have obvious exaggerations. There are no dramatic screams, no long or complicated words, no clear attempt to scare anyone. That goes against the logic of a hoax. People who fake things usually overdo it. Here, what you hear is almost too restrained, like the communication is happening at the bare minimum necessary. Enough to be understood, but not enough to be easily explained. In more detailed analyses, even more disturbing observations showed up. The voice frequency stays stable in sections where a normal person would naturally vary. The projection doesn't match someone hiding behind trees or trying to move away. It seems to come from a fixed, steady point, like the source wasn't worried about being concealed in that exact moment. That raises a hard possibility to ignore. Maybe there was no expectation that anyone would analyze it later. Another important point is that the audio doesn't seem to answer direct questions. Reacts to presence. That changes everything. It isn't a conventional conversation. It's recognition. As if the simple fact that a person existed, there was enough to trigger a vocal response. That pushes the performance theory even further away, because it requires an environmental reading that isn't typical of jokes or stage scares. Over time, it became clear that the biggest mistake with this audio is trying to force it into something familiar. It doesn't want to be forced. It demands a different posture, listening more carefully, less desperate to conclude. And maybe that's exactly why so many people give up on analyzing material like this early on. Because it offers no comfort. It offers no closure. If you're listening to this and thinking recordings like this are never taken seriously, comment, "No one explains," because that feeling comes up again and again in stories like this. There's always someone trying to normalize it too fast, to close the case before it gets too big. The audio also carries something that's hard to measure: presence. Not in a mystical sense, but psychologically. It makes the listener feel like they're not dealing with an isolated event, but with something that belongs to the environment, like that voice wasn't just passing through, but had been there the whole time, only rarely revealing itself. That creates a deep rupture in how we see the forest, because it stops being only physical space and becomes occupied space. And when occupied space speaks, even briefly, it redefines the rules of interaction. We're not talking about distant mystery anymore. We're talking about invisible coexistence. Many tried to explain this audio as an unlikely mix of natural sounds, echo, reverberation, coincidence. But those explanations don't hold when the clip is replayed in slow motion, when frequencies are isolated, when it's compared with databases of known sounds. Something always remains unresolved, a gap outside the pattern, an inflection that shouldn't exist. What makes it even more unsettling is realizing this isn't the only audio like it. It's just the clearest one. There are others more confusing, more fragmented, easier to dismiss. But when you listen to them together, a pattern begins to emerge, not of words, but of behavior. And behavior is much harder to explain than noise. If this is already pulling you out of your comfort zone, right, it's not just sound, because that's the turning point here. The problem was never the noise. The problem is what the noise reveals when you pay close enough attention. From this point on, it becomes impossible to treat that audio as an isolated curiosity. It starts functioning like a key that opens other stories, other accounts, other situations where people heard things they tried to forget, not because they didn't believe what they heard, but because believing it would carry consequences that were too heavy. And the more I put these pieces together, the more obvious it became that the audio didn't need to be perfect to be disturbing. It only needed to exist. Because the simple existence of something like this challenges the idea that we know everything that can happen on a trail, in a forest, in a space we insist on calling wilderness, as if that meant empty. This audio doesn't prove everything. It doesn't solve anything on its own. But it opens a crack that's hard to close, a crack that starts small, almost imperceptible, and widens as you realize it isn't the only thing that doesn't fit. And that crack leads directly into the next part of this story, where the question stops being about the sound itself and becomes about who was on the other side of it. The woman who made this recording wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. That detail changes everything about how this story needs to be told. She didn't have a channel. She didn't have followers. She didn't have a history of getting involved in theories, and she had no interest in placing herself at the center of something extraordinary. Her life was too ordinary to fit inside a story like this, and maybe that's exactly why it gets heavier when you understand who she was before that day. She worked. She had a routine, predictable hours, normal worries. She didn't live for the forest. She didn't spend her days chasing mysteries. She didn't collect strange accounts. The recording happened because she was doing something simple, almost automatic, something anyone might do without thinking. Twice, capturing an ordinary moment, saving ambient sound, creating a small memory that didn't seem important. Nothing about it was meant to become evidence of anything. People close to her described someone quiet, careful, not prone to exaggeration. She wasn't the type to dramatize events or chase attention with wild stories. If anything, she was seen as grounded, practical, almost too skeptical at times. That matters when you look at what came after, because it dismantles the easy narrative that this is all imagination or invention. Before this, she had never reported strange experiences on trails or in nature. She didn't talk about mystical feelings. She didn't mention presences. She didn't show excessive fear of open spaces. To her, the forest was just the forest, a place to walk, breathe, disconnect from routine, nothing more. And it's exactly that normalcy that makes the recording so hard to dismiss. The moment she realized something was wrong wasn't immediate. There was no instant panic, no dramatic reaction. The discomfort came later, when she listened to the audio calmly, away from the place it was recorded. That's when it clicked. That's when she understood she had captured something she couldn't explain, something that didn't match any previous experience in her life. She hesitated for a long time before sharing the material with anyone, not only out of fear of being judged, but because she didn't want to cause alarm without understanding what she had. That kind of hesitation is common in responsible people who understand the weight of an extraordinary claim. She tried to explain it to herself first. She tried to find simple reasons. She tried to forget it. None of it worked. When she finally played the audio for someone she trusted, the reaction wasn't immediate mockery. It was silence. An uncomfortable silence, the kind that happens when no one knows what to say. And for her, that was more disturbing than disbelief, because silence doesn't deny, but it doesn't explain either. It just leaves the question hanging in the air. If you've ever been through something strange and didn't know who you could tell, right? I kept it in the comments. Because that kind of experience creates a quiet isolation that's hard to describe. You end up carrying something you never asked to live through, with nowhere to put it. Another important point is that she never tried to monetize this recording. She never tried to sell it, never ran to the media, never chased public validation. If anything, there were times when she tried to keep it from spreading further than necessary. That's the opposite of how people tend to behave when they invent or exaggerate stories for attention. Here, the movement was always toward containment, not exposure. Over time, this experience started to affect how she related to natural environments. Not in an irrational way, but in a subtle shift of perception. She began paying closer attention, listening more, noticing silences where she used to see only scenery, not because she wanted to, but because something had been switched on inside her, an uncomfortable awareness that couldn't be turned off. It's important to say she didn't present herself as a victim or as someone chosen. She didn't attach some grand meaning to the fact that she recorded it. To her, it was an unfortunate accident, an unwanted collision between everyday life and something that never should have shown itself. That stance is one of the strongest markers of credibility in her account. No ego, no mission, just discomfort. People close to her noticed small changes afterward, nothing extreme, but real. More caution when choosing trails, extra attention to strange sounds, a certain unease when the topic came up, even when she was asked about it. It wasn't excitement. It was weight, like every time it resurfaced, something reopened. If you can imagine how this would affect an ordinary person, right? I believe her in the comments. Not as proof, but as empathy. It's easy to dismiss stories like this when they feel far away. It's much harder when you understand the kind of person behind them. What stands out most is that even after everything, she never claimed to fully understand what she heard. She didn't label it. She didn't conclude. She didn't close the story. She only described. And that lack of conclusion may be the most honest part of her entire account. Because when something truly slips beyond understanding, the only responsible thing to do is admit it. Over time, other people began connecting her recording to similar reports, similar sounds, similar patterns, situations where someone heard something and chose not to dig deeper. And even then, she never positioned herself as the center of that connection. She never presented herself as the reference point. She kept her distance, like someone who knows certain things grow too fast once they're exposed. That posture raises an important question. If someone with no interest in fame, no history of exaggeration, and no intention of proving anything records something like this, what does that say about the phenomenon itself? Maybe the focus was never the person recording, but whatever chose to reveal itself to an ordinary person in the most unexpected moment possible. Her story matters not because she was special, but precisely because she wasn't, because it could have been anyone there. It could have been you. It could have been someone you know. And that possibility shatters the comfortable distance between a strange story and everyday life. And the more you understand who she was before that day, the harder it becomes to reduce this to imagination or a hoax. Made-up stories usually begin with people looking for something. This began with someone looking for nothing and finding something she wished she had never found. That's why, from here on out, the narrative shifts. Because we're no longer talking about a weird audio clip. We're talking about an interaction, a contact, something that happened between two aware presences, even if they don't share the same level of understanding. And understanding that exact moment, the instant the voice wasn't just heard, but responded, is the next unavoidable step in this story. The first contact didn't happen like a clean scene with a clear beginning and end. It revealed itself slowly, almost like the situation itself was testing how far it could go without being interrupted. At first, the woman didn't realize there was any interaction at all. She heard the voice once, then again, always with strange intervals, too long to be echo, too organized to be random. Still, the mind insists on normalizing. It always does. What changed everything was the moment she reacted, not in a planned way, not with the intention of provoking anything. It was a basic human reflex, almost automatic. A quiet comment, a single word, said more to herself than to the environment. Nothing that sounded like a call. Nothing that felt like an invitation. Just presence being recognized by another presence. Then came silence. A thick silence, different from the ordinary quiet of the woods. It wasn't an absence of sound, it was suspension, like the space had paused to decide something. That interval matters because it breaks the logic of noise. Natural sounds don't evaluate. They don't wait. They don't choose when to respond. But that silence felt exactly like that, waiting. When the voice returned, it didn't repeat what had been heard before. It didn't follow a fixed pattern. It didn't sound like a replayed recording or a reflected sound. It responded to the moment, short, precise, directed. There was no attempt to physically approach, no noticeable movement. The response came from the same point of origin, as if whatever was speaking was comfortable right where it was. She described that part as the hardest to process, because that's where the possibility of coincidence started to collapse. It was no longer a random sound captured by accident. It was a reaction, and reactions require awareness of the other. Even if minimal, even if different from ours, it's still awareness. The exchange, if it can even be called, that didn't follow any human logic of conversation. There weren't long back-and-forth lines, no developed sentences. It was fragmented, almost economical. Few words, long pauses. And still, it carried meaning, not in complex content, but in intention. Something was being communicated, even if in a raw, stripped-down way. The most unsettling part is that nothing in that response felt improvised. There was no hesitation typical of someone trying to fool you or invent something. There was no excess. If anything, it felt like only the bare minimum was being said, as if more wasn't necessary, as if the main message wasn't in the words, but in the act of responding. If you've ever felt that sharp chill when something answers back when it shouldn't, right? It answered. In the comments. Not because it's instant fear, but because it shatters expectation. The world stops working the way you thought it was supposed to. Another important detail is that the voice showed no curiosity, no questions, no attempt to explore who was there. That's counterintuitive if you think of contact as exchange. But here, the contact seemed to have a different purpose, not to get to know, not to converse, but to mark presence, to make it clear that whoever was on the other side had been noticed. She said that in that moment, something became painfully clear. This wasn't happening so she could understand it. It was happening so it could be recorded, as if the simple fact of being heard and captured was enough. That realization didn't come as a carefully built thought, but as a heavy intuition she couldn't shake. After that response, the silence returned. Not abrupt, not theatrical, just an ending, like the interaction had done what it needed to do. No goodbye. No obvious closure. The voice simply didn't come back. And that matters as much as the moment it spoke, because it signals control. It began when it wanted. It ended when it decided. Listening to the audio later, away from the woods, that pattern became even clearer. The responses don't overlap. They don't interrupt. They don't invade. They show up exactly after specific stimuli. That destroys the idea of mechanical repetition or sonic coincidence. There's contextual reading. There's adjustment. Some people who analyzed that specific segment pointed out that the response doesn't carry recognizable emotion. It isn't aggressive. It isn't friendly. It isn't neutral in an empty way. It's functional. And that might be the most unsettling part of all. Emotion is what we use to humanize. Function points to purpose. If this is already making you uneasy, comment, "It wasn't random," because this is where many people realize the story has moved past curiosity and into something much more serious. After that moment, she didn't try to provoke another response. Not because she didn't want to, but because she felt that pushing further would cross a boundary that hadn't been explained, but was clearly there. And that kind of boundary isn't usually learned through instruction. It's felt. What remained wasn't just a strange audio clip, but the certainty that something on the other side understood perfectly that it had been heard. That changes the entire relationship to the recording. It's no longer a person observing something unknown. It's two aware presences recognizing each other, even if briefly. That silent recognition is what makes this recording so hard to ignore, because we're not just talking about sound or myth or exaggerated interpretation. We're talking about response, and responses carry responsibility. From that point on, the entire story takes on a different weight, because if something responds, then something watches. And if something watches, then there may be criteria, boundaries, and decisions being made outside our field of perception. And that's exactly what starts to reveal itself when you look closely at what was said, not as isolated words, but as warning. That's where the story enters even more delicate territory, because understanding that there was a response is only the beginning. What really matters, and what makes all of this even harder to accept, is understanding the meaning of what was communicated in that brief contact. And that's what starts to surface when you analyze the content of those words, and why they were never treated openly. What was said was never long, never elaborate, never presented like a speech. And maybe that's exactly why it's so disturbing. The words were too simple, too direct. There was no metaphor, no obvious emotion, no attempt to explain or persuade. What existed was something that sounded like a warning, like a boundary, like the minimum communication necessary to make it clear that space wasn't neutral. When the woman heard it and later replayed it in her mind, her first reaction wasn't fear, it was confusion, because it didn't feel like a threat in a human way. There was no explicit aggression, no promise of violence. What existed was an implicit claim of territory, something very close to the idea of this is as far as you go, an invisible line being drawn not on the ground, but in the mind of whoever was listening. That kind of message is hard to fit into any official report because it doesn't present itself as a crime, an attack, or a measurable event. It's a warning, and warnings demand interpretation. They demand context. They demand admitting that something on the other side understands space, understands human presence, and reacts intentionally. Institutions don't handle that well because there isn't a protocol for it. The words, isolated from the emotional context, might even sound harmless to someone who doesn't understand the setting. But spoken there, in that moment, coming from where they came from, they carry a completely different weight. They don't sound like curiosity or friendly contact. They sound like functional communication said because it needed to be said, not because there was interest in a conversation. Another important point is that there wasn't exaggerated repetition, no insistence, no hammering it in. It was said once, maybe twice, and then it stopped. That reinforces the sense of boundary. A warning doesn't need to be repeated endlessly. It exists to be registered, not debated. That's exactly why this kind of message never shows up in official reports. Not because someone is deliberately hiding it, but because accepting it would mean admitting something deeply uncomfortable, that there are communications happening outside our system of control, that not every interaction in the natural world is silent, that maybe not every silence is absence. When experts or authorities come across something like this, the most common impulse isn't to investigate deeply, it's to minimize, label it irrelevant, file it as noise. Because taking a message like this seriously opens a door nobody wants to walk through, a door that leads to questions with no simple answers. And unanswered questions are an institutional problem. This kind of censorship doesn't look like the movies, with explicit orders or secret documents. It's quiet, bureaucratic, an audio clip not analyzed, a simplified report, a case explained away as human error. It's easier to say it doesn't make sense than to explain why it makes too much sense. If you feel like this kind of silence happens often whenever something breaks the pattern, write, "No one wants to touch it" in the comments. Because this reaction isn't exclusive to this case. It repeats any time an explanation threatens the structure we rely on to feel safe. Another detail that carries weight is that the message doesn't demand complex symbolism. It doesn't require decoding. It's almost blunt. That removes the idea that we're projecting meaning onto something neutral. The impact comes from the simplicity because there's nowhere to romanticize it, nowhere to soften it. The woman never described those words as something grand. She never said she felt chosen or special. If anything, she described it as impersonal, like the message wasn't meant specifically for her, but for any human presence crossing that boundary. That reinforces territory, not personal contact. When other people heard the audio, this most common reaction wasn't panic. It was a heavy silence, the kind that happens when no one wants to be the first to say the obvious. Because saying the obvious would mean admitting there are rules we don't know, and admitting that changes how we look at trails, forests, and disappearances. If you understand how simple words can carry huge meaning depending on who says them and where they come from, comment, "It was a warning," because that reading starts to force itself on you when you see them. Full context. It's important to understand that this message isn't forbidden because it's immediately dangerous. It's forbidden because it destabilizes. It pulls the human being out of the center. It suggests we aren't the only ones able to name, define, and control spaces. And that's something our culture, in general, resists accepting. Over time, other recordings with vaguely similar content were dismissed for the same reason. Not because they were clearly fake, but because they were clearly problematic. They required a change in posture. They required admitting there may be interactions happening outside our institutional radar, outside our official vocabulary. This kind of silence also protects the people who manage natural areas. It isn't easy to admit you don't know exactly what happens in a territory you oversee. It isn't comfortable to admit there are boundaries that don't appear on maps or signs. So the easiest choice is to treat everything as an isolated exception, never a pattern. But when you connect that simple message to other accounts, to other stories of people who heard similar things, to disappearances that never had satisfying explanations, the weight starts to accumulate. The word stops being just a word. It becomes a piece of a larger system of quiet communication. If you've ever felt that certain warnings aren't meant to be debated, only respected, write, "I get it" in the comments. Because that feeling hits hard when you're dealing with something that doesn't want attention, only distance. What was said in that moment doesn't end the story. If anything, it opens a chain of implications. If there's a warning, there's history. If there's history, there's repetition. And if there's repetition, then this kind of communication isn't an accident or an exception. It's part of a broader behavior. That's why the content is treated as forbidden. Not because someone is hiding a specific secret, but because it points to a reality nobody knows how to manage in public. A reality where the forest isn't just background, but an active presence. A reality where not every voice comes from where we expect. And as that understanding starts to form, the question stops being only what was said and becomes something heavier. Why did something feel the need to say it now? And that's the question that begins to take shape when we shift the lens and start seeing Bigfoot not as myth or monster, but as a constant, ancient, deeply territorial presence. From the moment that voice was heard and examined closely, it became impossible to talk about Bigfoot the same way again. The classic image of a confused, aggressive, wandering monster starts to crumble once you add speech, because speech isn't raw instinct. Speech is choice. It's organized intelligence. And that changes Bigfoot's role in the woods completely. For decades, Bigfoot was pushed into a comfortable corner of pop culture. A huge, powerful creature, maybe dangerous, but essentially chaotic, something that appears and disappears without logic, without pattern, without clear intention. That version works because it keeps the hierarchy intact. Humans observe, categorize, control the narrative, but that recording doesn't fit. It suggests something much older, much more adapted, much more aware of the space it occupies. When you start comparing that recording with older accounts, especially oral histories from communities who have lived near forests for generations, coincidence starts to feel less like coincidence. In many of those stories, the presence we now call Bigfoot was never described as a monster. It appears as a guardian, an original inhabitant, something that watches and reacts when certain boundaries are crossed, not out of cruelty, but out of preservation. Those narratives were always dismissed as folklore because they didn't fit the traditional scientific model. But they share a common thread: territory. The idea that there are places that don't belong to humans, even if humans insist on crossing through them. And when you place that idea beside the simple, direct content of that audio, the connection becomes hard to ignore. Speech changes everything because it removes randomness. A strange sound can be dismissed as an error. A silent presence can be denied. But an articulated vocal response suggests understanding, awareness of the other, enough consciousness to decide when to speak and when to stay silent. That turns Bigfoot from something observe into an active agent. If you feel how much this shift changes the story, right, it's not a monster in the comments, because this conceptual turn is essential to what comes next. Another thing that starts making sense once you abandon the monster narrative is the modern pattern of encounters. People reporting a sense of warning, of limits, of the feeling that taking one more step would be a mistake. Reports of sudden silence, of sounds stopping abruptly, of an environment that feels like it's watching back. Those experiences were always treated as too subjective to matter. But through this new lens, they start to look like part of the same territorial behavior. The recorded speech doesn't sound like a desire for social contact. It sounds like the minimum necessary communication, said not to start a relationship, but to mark position. And that's exactly what you'd expect from a presence that doesn't want to be seen, studied, or integrated into the human world, but also doesn't accept unlimited intrusion. That kind of behavior aligns with something that's existed in a territory for a long time, something that has learned over generations that silence protects more than exposure, that speaking rarely is more effective than reacting constantly, and that in certain moments, a short message can prevent bigger consequences. When Bigfoot is seen this way, other pieces start to lock into place. The rarity of clear recordings, the absence of bodies in certain disappearances, the repetition of areas where strange encounters concentrate, not as random attacks, but as correction, as response to imbalance. That idea is uncomfortable because it removes humans from the role of sole manager of the natural world. If you've ever felt like certain places have their own rules, comment, "There are limits," because that sensation shows up often once you start seeing the forest not as scenery, but as inhabited territory. Speech also redefines the power dynamic. As long as Bigfoot is mute, he can be treated as an object of study. The moment he speaks, he takes a position. He stops being only something observed and becomes something that observes back. That creates an asymmetry our culture doesn't handle well. We prefer predictable monsters over conscious presences. That's why the monster narrative was always reinforced. It simplifies. It creates fear that feels manageable. But the idea of an ancient, intelligent, territorial presence is far harder to manage because it suggests coexistence, not domination. It suggests we may never have been the only ones making the rules. Indigenous stories from different regions talk about beings that communicate only when necessary, that avoid direct contact, that protect specific areas, that punish excess. Those stories were dismissed as myth because they didn't fit the colonial model of land use and control. But when you listen to that audio with this in mind, it stops sounding isolated and starts sounding like continuity. Modern life didn't erase these presences. It just laid maps, trails, and signs over them. And maybe that recorded speech is a signal that the overlap has reached a point of friction. Not because something new appeared, but because something old has been pushed too far. If you feel how this reading changes the way you interpret encounters and disappearances, right, it makes sense now. Because that phrase tends to show up when older pieces suddenly align in an unexpected way. From this perspective, Bigfoot doesn't need to be everywhere or constantly violent. He only needs to exist consistently in certain territories. He doesn't need to attack every time. He only needs to act enough to maintain the balance he believes is necessary. And that explains why many encounters end without direct confrontation, but leave deep psychological marks. The recorded speech isn't proof of friendliness or hostility. It's proof of conscious presence. And conscious presence implies decision. It implies criteria. It implies that maybe not every disappearance is an accident, and not every silence is empty. This conceptual shift also helps explain why so many people who have strange experiences in forests report changes afterward, not because they clearly saw something, but because they felt evaluated, like they crossed an invisible gaze, like they heard something they weren't supposed to hear. From here on out, the story stops being about belief or disbelief. It becomes about forced coexistence. What happens when two forms of conscious presence occupy the same space without explicit agreement, and one of them rarely decides to speak? That understanding sets the stage for something even more delicate. Because if Bigfoot speaks to mark limits, then there's a reason that warning was given in that specific moment. And understanding why then, why there, and why in that way is the next unavoidable step in this story. They never talked about this because there's no official place to put something like it. There's no form, category, report, or protocol for dealing with something that speaks, thinks, and sets boundaries outside any known human structure. Institutions run on classifications. Something is animal, human, natural phenomenon, or human error. When something doesn't fit any of those boxes, it doesn't get investigated. It gets pushed out of the conversation. Cases like this aren't denied outright because denial requires confrontation, and confrontation requires arguments. What usually happens is far more effective: ridicule and silence. Ridicule keeps the topic from growing. Silence keeps it from connecting to other accounts. You don't have to say something is false. You just have to treat it like absurdity, exaggeration, or insanity. Over time, nobody wants to be associated with it. That mechanism works because it hits people's social fear directly. Nobody wants to be seen as unstable. Nobody wants to risk their reputation over something they can't prove beyond any doubt. So accounts get softened, edited, retold incompletely, or simply kept to oneself. Not because people don't believe what they lived through, but because they know they won't be taken seriously. The problem is that this kind of silence doesn't eliminate the phenomenon. It just pushes it into the underground layers of society-closed groups, private conversations, stories, traded in low voices. The topic still exists, just without legitimate public space. And that creates the false impression that these cases are rare, isolated, almost non-existent. If you've noticed how certain topics get turned into jokes before anyone even looks at them, right, they always mock it in the comments. Because that pattern repeats any time something threatens to slip out of the established narrative control. Another reason nobody talks about this openly is the institutional impact of admitting it. Recognizing an intelligent, territorial, communicative presence in natural areas would mean rethinking basic ideas of safety, land use, and responsibility. Who takes the liability when someone crosses a boundary that isn't on the map? Who answers when there's no sign, but there's a warning? It's easier to keep everything in the realm of individual weirdness than to admit a collective problem. One strange audio becomes a curiosity. One isolated account becomes an exaggeration. But when you stack multiple cases, multiple recordings, multiple similar experiences, the whole starts demanding an answer. And that's exactly what gets avoided. That silence also protects a very specific idea that humans are the only conscious agents in wild spaces. That idea supports the whole logic of exploration, tourism, open trails, accessible parks. Challenging it isn't just uncomfortable, it's economically and politically complicated. So the simplest path is pretending there's nothing to challenge. If you feel like a lot gets pushed out of public conversation, not because there's no evidence, but because the implications are too heavy, comment, "No one wants to deal with it," because that's what's happening here. Cases like this are also buried because they offer no closure. They don't give a neat narrative with a clean beginning, middle, and end. There's no clear villain, no solution, no comforting conclusion. There's only forced coexistence with the unknown. And our culture prefers resolved stories, even false ones, over open stories that demand constant vigilance. Ridicule plays another role too. It discourages new witnesses. When someone sees what happens to the people who speak up, they learn quickly to stay quiet. That collective learning creates a cycle. Fewer public accounts lead to less official interest, which produces even more silence. It isn't an organized conspiracy. It's automatic social behavior. This woman's audio slid into that cycle. It wasn't aggressively denied. It wasn't deeply analyzed. It was pushed to the margin, treated as a weird curiosity, easy to dismiss, hard to defend. And that's far more effective than explicit censorship. If you've noticed how certain stories disappear, not because they're false, but because they're inconvenient, right? They vanish in the comments. Because this kind of erasure happens quietly, constantly. Another factor is that talking about this would require changing how we see older accounts. Stories dismissed as myth or superstition would need to be revisited. That would mean admitting we were wrong for a long time. And institutions rarely do that without intense pressure. Meanwhile, the public learns to laugh, minimize, treat it like entertainment. Bigfoot becomes a punchline. Voices in the woods become creepypasta. Everything gets turned into something safe, distant, consumable. And that protects everyone from the discomfort of looking closer. But there's a limit to this kind of silence. It works as long as cases stay fragmented. When they start connecting, when patterns start emerging, when recordings appear with consistent elements, the strategy begins to fail. Because the sum of small absurdities starts to look too coherent to ignore. That's exactly the feeling that starts building here. The sense that we're not accessing something new. but something that was always there, just outside the spotlight. Something pushed out of public conversation because there was no language that could handle it. And once you see that, you realize silence isn't a lack of information. It's a choice. A collective choice, comfortable and dangerous at the same time. Because while nobody speaks, nobody prepares. While nobody admits it, nobody sets clear limits. That's why this kind of case never becomes official. Not because there isn't isolated evidence, but because accumulated evidence demands a shift in posture that nobody wants to lead. And in that vacuum, stories like this keep happening, captured by accident by ordinary people and pushed back out of the conversation. What makes it even more unsettling is realizing that despite institutional silence, something on the other side chose to speak. And when a presence that's always been treated like myth decides to communicate, even briefly, maybe it's because silence is no longer enough. When Bigfoot speaks, everything that felt distant suddenly turns practical. The recording stops being a strange curiosity and becomes a dividing line. Because speaking isn't entertainment, speaking is action. And action like that changes how we read disappearances, ignore warnings, and invisible borders that never showed up on maps, but have always existed for anyone who knew how to see them. The moment you accept that the voice wasn't noise, a prank, or coincidence, one question becomes unavoidable. Why warn? Warnings only make sense when there's repetition, when something happens enough times to require communication. And that casts a new light on old stories of people who felt they shouldn't go farther, who reported unease without a clear reason, who heard something and chose to leave without being able to explain why. Those experiences were always treated as subjective, emotional imagination. But when you place them beside a real, articulated, conscious recording, the word imagination starts losing its power. What takes its place is the idea of a boundary, not political, not physical in the usual sense, but behavioral. A point after which human presence stops being tolerated. If you've ever felt like certain places are telling you, that's far enough, right? There are limits in the comments. Because that perception shows up often, once you start understanding the forest isn't just empty space, it's shared territory. Disappearances, through this lens, stop being isolated accidents and start looking like outcomes. Not punishments in a human sense, but responses to transgressions we don't recognize as transgressions. People walking into areas they don't understand, ignoring subtle signals, not realizing when they've crossed something that wasn't meant to be crossed. That doesn't turn Bigfoot into a villain or a hero. It turns him into an agent, something that acts according to its own criteria that don't need explanation to function. And that's exactly why the speech is so uncomfortable. It reveals intention behind the silence. It shows that muteness may not be inability, but choice. When you understand that, disappearances change scale. It's no longer just about finding bodies or explaining vanishings. It's about asking why certain places accumulate similar cases, why certain trails concentrate strange reports, why informal warnings repeat right before things go wrong. Speech also changes responsibility, because if there's a warning, there's a chance to turn back. And that puts a new weight on what we choose to ignore, not as individual blame, but as something collective. How many times did we normalize strange accounts because we didn't know where to file them? How many times did we keep moving forward because nobody taught us to recognize boundaries that aren't official? If you feel how this changes the way you look at trails and forests, comment, it's not just adventure, because adventure assumes there are no rules. Here, what starts to appear is the opposite. The recording also exposes a cultural problem. We struggle to deal with messages that don't invite dialogue, only respect. We're conditioned to demand full explanations, justifications, definitive proof. But that warning wasn't meant to convince. It was meant to mark. And that completely destabilizes the modern logic of validation. When Bigfoot speaks, he isn't trying to prove he exists. He doesn't need that. He's reacting to something, and reaction implies context. That changes the focus. The question stops being, is it real? And becomes, what caused this? What was happening that made silence no longer enough? That shift also explains why so many people Report feeling evaluated in natural spaces, not in a mystical way, but like their presence is being noticed. Unease that doesn't become panic, but encourages retreat. Those stories were always dismissed as overactive intuition, but placed next to conscious speech, they start to sound like part of the same system of nonverbal communication. If you've ever ignored that kind of feeling and regretted it later, write, "I felt it," in the comments. Because these accounts pile up in silence precisely because we lack language for them. Another important point is that speech redefines invisibility. It's no longer something that can't be seen, but something that chooses when to show itself and when to stay quiet. That explains why clear recordings are rare, why evidence is fragmented, why it's hard to capture something that doesn't want to be captured. Speech doesn't break that pattern, it confirms it. When something invisible speaks, even rarely, it suggests necessity. And necessity suggests pressure. Pressure suggests imbalance. That opens a more unsettling reading. Maybe the rise in reports, recordings, and encounters is linked to intensified human presence in areas that used to remain relatively undisturbed. Open trails, expanded parks, growing tourism, constant intrusion. Those things changed the balance of territories that operated under different rules. And when those rules are violated repeatedly, silence may stop being an effective strategy. If that idea makes you uneasy, comment, "We're intruding," because that word starts to appear when you connect human expansion with rising silent conflict. Speech also changes how ridicule works. You can laugh away a silent unknown more easily than a voice that answers back. Ridicule is a strong defense against a mute mystery. It loses power when the mystery responds. Maybe that's why this recording hits so hard. It pulls the audience out of the safe seat of spectator and places them as a possible participant. That creates a psychological effect that's hard to ignore. Not immediate fear, but vigilance. A different attention to the environment. An awareness that not every silence is empty and not every sound is random. And once that awareness takes root, it doesn't fade easily. From this point on, the story stops being about myth, folklore, or curiosity. It becomes about forced coexistence between conscious presences that don't share the same language or the same interests. And when one of them decides to speak, even briefly, it shifts the balance of that coexistence. The most unsettling part is that speech doesn't offer a solution. It doesn't explain how to avoid conflict. It doesn't lay out clear rules. It only marks a boundary. And boundaries, without explanation, demand constant attention. They demand humility. They demand admitting we don't know everything about the spaces we occupy. That's why this recording carries so much weight. It doesn't offer comfort or closure. It offers responsibility. The responsibility to recognize that messages may be happening all the time in forms we choose to ignore because they don't translate into certainty. And when you understand that, you realize the impact of the speech isn't just in what was said, but in what it forces you to reconsider. Trails stop being just paths. Forests stop being just scenery. Bigfoot stops being just a legend. Everything starts to look like part of a living system, alert, aware, and at certain moments, willing to reveal itself. That understanding sets the stage for the final step of this story. Because once something speaks and makes it clear there is intention, the unavoidable question is no longer about proof or belief. It's about consequence. What happens when we keep moving forward as if we didn't hear anything? And that's exactly where everything you've heard so far begins to carry a heavier psychological cost. What weighs the most? After all, this isn't doubt about Bigfoot's existence, but the way we react when something breaks the hierarchy that always keeps us on top. The recording doesn't challenge just one belief, it challenges the comforting idea that we're the only ones capable of observing, interpreting, and deciding. When a presence that's always been treated like myth chooses to speak, even for a few seconds, it exposes something bigger, how much we rely on silence to keep our certainty intact. Maybe the problem was never a lack of proof, but the weight of what proof would mean. Accepting that something like this can speak means accepting we don't fully control the spaces we occupy or the invisible rules operating inside them. It means admitting the world isn't just a stage for our stories, but a shared environment where other forms of awareness may exist without asking permission or needing recognition. The silence that follows that realization isn't empty. It's loaded. It's the silence of someone who understands certain questions get avoided, not because they're absurd, but because they're too deep. Questions that don't demand immediate answers, but constant attention. Questions that keep echoing even after the recording ends. And it's exactly that discomfort that connects this story to others. The video appearing on your screen now isn't a continuation of this account. It isn't about this woman or this specific recording. It's another story, another context, another secret. But it touches the same sensitive nerve, the things we'd rather not name, quiet forces that span generations and human decisions that leave invisible marks. Sometimes the biggest change doesn't happen when something is explained, but when we realize there have always been things out there speaking in ways we've chosen not to hear.